Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session on adopting SEBI's cybersecurity and cyber resilience framework, also known as CSCRF, hosted by In.Talks, an S&M group company. From ground rules perspective, we'll take questions at the end. Nara has a certain overview to discuss, and then we will have time for questions for about 20 minutes at the end. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A tab. You can type your questions there, and I will be your host for the next 55 minutes. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to introduce In.Talks Global as well as S&M Group. In.Talks Global is a Singapore-based professional services firms. We look at compliance, tax, assurance, managed services, sustainability as different service lines. Cybersecurity and cyber resilience is a part of our risk advisory practice. We are looking at more than I think 3,000 market players now required to adopt the CSCRF framework from SEBI. This creates an immense rush from the market perspective to be able to get this right, given that it's a regulatory requirement. In.Talks Global, apart from India, has about 1,500 to 2,000 employees across the Asia Pacific region. We also have, we are a part of S&M Group that has about 3,500 employees around the world. In.Talks Group, again, globally headquartered in Singapore, set up its presence in India about 6 years ago. And today we are about a 550 people strong business operating across 10 different service lines. My name is Dhaval Shah. I am the Chief Growth Officer for In.Talks in India. My role is to make sure that our clients get the kind of services and solutions that will help them build their business and strengthen their overall profile. I'm delighted to welcome Narasimhan. Narasimhan is a good friend. He is also a very good cybersecurity expert with over 15 years of experience on cybersecurity. Incidentally, Narasimhan is also a chartered accountant, so he understands both sides of the fence. He understands the requirements from a rigor, from an audit and a risk perspective. At the same time, he has done more than 500 assignments over the last 15 years on building cybersecurity for his clients in India as well as in the US. I welcome Narasimhan to this meeting.
Thank you.
We look forward to understand your insights on how do we adopt the SEBI cybersecurity and cyber resilience framework. This is particularly applicable to market intermediaries registered with SEBI. However, I would like this session to be more practical, more real world rather than theoretical. And this is a discussion I have had with Narasimhan. And we will spend a lot of time in how do we adopt, what are the steps, what are the challenges, rather than talking about the larger picture and more, why are we doing this? So with that, I'd like to invite Narasimhan to probably begin with an overview of CSCRF so that all the attendees are on the same page before we dive into more details.
Sure. Thank you, Dhaval. I'll probably get started just giving some perspectives. First and foremost, in the last 8 to 10 years, every regulator across the world, not just India, is increasing their framework relating to cybersecurity. And it could be in terms of, simple things like mandatory compliance procedures or requirements of audit, requirement of board governance. And this has become a common topic. And look at probably post-pandemic era, there is an increasing need which is felt. But now, especially after the pandemic, they not only started looking at cybersecurity, they started focusing on resilience, ability of a machine or system, a process or an organization to still withstand a failure and still serve businesses. We have had unfortunate incidents where ransomware attacks have taken place, right? And those sort of things, whether organizations are ready to probably handle that sort of a scenario, right? So those are the extreme scenarios. So what SEBI did, and let me remind you, this is not that they did for the first time. They did have some guidance, but they brought it together applicable uniformly as one guideline. Of course, there is a staggered way of implementation, which I will cover it a little later. But they said, let's come up with one guidance, a little over 200 pages, may not be worthy of reading on a post-lunch scenario, right? But that's what they came up with. And they said two broad things: cyber security, cyber resilience. Two things they came up with. And if I have to probably go a little deeper, they defined what is called as goals from a resilience as well as cybersecurity function perspective. The image, what you see there, the third line, which talks about cybersecurity functions, these are the broad functions which every organization will have to probably develop and deploy. And these are functional requirements. As much as we have finance, tax, etc., the governance function focus on setting policies. It could be even a 2-member team. It could be even a 500-member organization. Governance is all about making sure that whether you have the risk management and policy in place, right? Second comes your identification element. This is where you identify your assets, your software, your facilities, your data, whatever information you have, you're identifying that. Then comes the protection element, which is relating to how are you safeguarding, starting from simplest things of your antivirus. It could go slightly more complex where you want to make sure your data is protected, or your confidential data is not leaked out. So therefore, you might use certain things like a data loss prevention solutions, right? So protection comes in. Now, detect is a layer or a function where you're talking about periodical monitoring. Identify if there is any issues, right? And this is where they've brought up a mandatory monitoring system, sometimes an overkill, but that is what they have said it is required. And then comes your response. How quickly are you able to respond and recover from that particular incident? So those are the six odd functions. And these 6 functions also have resilience goals, which they have defined. Now, in terms of applicability, interestingly, this is applicable for all the entities which are registered with SEBI. There are 19 odd categories, and all of them have, these are also called as SEBI intermediaries. And for the sake of clarification, let me bring up one very important point. Don't think that this is applicable for listed companies unless they fall under one of these buckets. An example could be a company like HDFC AMC is a SEBI intermediary and is also listed. Therefore, for them, this would be applicable. Vis-a-vis an organization ABC, who is just a listed company, whose shares or debentures are listed, right? For them, what applies is your listing obligation requirements and not something specific as far as this framework is concerned. Even they have requirements of cybersecurity, but that's on a different footage, right? Let's focus on these 19 odd players. Now, one could always ask a question, hey, these 19 players, SEBI has brought up a uniform requirements for all of them. I said the framework is uniform, but how it is made applicable varies. You have the largest player called as the market infra institutions, the likes of stock exchange, depositories, right? They're providing the real infrastructure. And then you have 4 categories of REs: qualified, mid-size, small size, and self-certified. Now, for each of those 19 players whom you saw in the previous slide, they fall under this 5 buckets. And it is based on a criteria. An example could be a stockbroker. His criteria is based upon UCC, which is called as unique client codes. On the contrary, you might have somebody as a asset management company, right? Or you have something to do with AIF. The entire basis is about the AUM size which they're carrying. So basis that this entire bifurcation actually plays a very important role, right? So that gives you a fair bit of a graded approach. And not to forget what happens to the timelines. The reality is this is applicable from 1st of January 2025 for the following players. However, the SEBI came up and said what is called as a regulatory forbearance, as long as you're able to prove until March that you have done some exercise or some activity to show that you're compliant. And for every other regulator, it is applicable from April 1, 2025. Every other registered entity, beg your pardon. Now, very important to note that this is applicable from April 1, 2025, which means your implementation should start beforehand. Considering this is the first year, we are all expecting that SEBI to give slight considerate as far as the implementation is concerned. So even if that implementation spills over, let us say in the month of April, it is still good enough, because the subsequent year you have to submit a report to showcase how compliant are you. And in that, probably the auditor will say, hey, only for 11 months they're compliant because 1 month they were implementing. So these are practical nuances. But be that as it may, hopefully I gave some perspective of what is the framework, and for whom is it applicable, and then on the timelines. The last bit which I'll quickly touch upon are what are some of the key requirements, because everybody keeps on saying, hey, 200 pages is too much. What is the key requirement? So broadly, they've given some perspectives from a governance. This talks about defining policies, and most of the smaller players may not have defined policies, and that's something which you should probably consider, right? A few examples of our clients where we have handled, we noticed that, they have certain things in understanding, but nothing documented, right? Some of them say, hey, I have antivirus solution. That's the only antivirus, or that's the only security measure I have, right? Probably you need to go a little beyond. And very importantly, roles and responsibilities. None of the clients where we have done the assessment, at least the smaller set of players, maybe the self-certified and the small REs, and to some extent, even the mid-size REs, we were not able to get any clear roles and responsibilities defined. In fact, just like how you have a compliance officer in these regulations, here you need to have a designated officer. That's another interesting thing which has to be defined, which means your roles and responsibilities, that means they need to have that bit of knowledge, awareness, right? It also makes a requirement for a cyber risk management to identify risks and mitigate, and what are do you have risk registers, right? How are you monitoring that? Very interestingly, most of us have an inventory of assets, and that's probably in an Excel spreadsheet, right? But maybe, have you ever thought that you need to convert this inventory of assets in terms of criticality? For example, you're using some key applications. If those, for a stockbroker, right, the key terminal license, of course, he might be using a SaaS solution or a off-the-shelf solution. But if that solution is down, it impacts his entire way of working, right? So assessment of those critical infrastructure is required, identification of assets, authentication, and this is one thing which we have noticed in most of the clients where we are doing this assessment, that they have a username and reasonably strong password, maybe 8 characters, because most of us are aware today that password has to be complicated, but many of them have not implemented the multi-factor authentication. And this is a classical case which we have noticed where organizations could be subject to a password hacking attack. Say, for example, somebody guesses your password, or somewhere there's a compromise of your password. I use that password to log in, right? If you have a multi-factor, at least you have an additional level of authentication, right? Then comes your element of security. It could be, how you're protecting some of the data called as regulatory data. Interestingly, they've said that all the data should be only in India. But during December, they came up with a clarification. They said that for now, we are probably not mandating that you have to have all data in India, because data centers in India are sort of growing. Another interesting thing which came up, and this is something which in a way it is good, in a way it is a challenge, right? Mandatory security operations or monitoring center. Imagine just like how you have a CCTV which is monitoring, or a security guard who's probably looking, in general, right? There is a system which is 24/7 monitoring your networks, your devices, your applications, or even your laptops. And that is something which is necessary. And they've classified as certain category of people need to have their own security operations center. And probably for the rest, because of the price sensitivities and other things, SEBI has asked stock exchanges to set up. And we have, in fact, helped a lot of clients in probably connecting with these players and formalizing the policies and setting it up. And that becomes a big win-win situation, because one side, they are recognized by the stock exchange themselves. And second, for smaller players, it might become quite challenging for you to set up your own market stock, right? Then comes an element of vulnerability penetration testing. In simple language, I'm sure most of them would have heard a concept called ethical hacking, right? Hacking, which is done for good, more on a preventive basis. And that's basically vulnerable assessment and penetration testing. So we are doing this assessment on the environment to identify key infra related vulnerabilities or weakness. And probably this is done at your network, at your firewalls, maybe at your overall internet connections, to identify where exactly the vulnerabilities are. And if you have external facing applications, including mobile applications and websites, this becomes even more mandatory. There is also a requirement for a cyber audit for certain categories twice a year, for rest once a year, except for the smaller player, right? This is something which has to be done. There is an incident response procedure, including reporting to CERT-In in case there has been an attack or a breach. And not to forget a mandatory requirement for cyber awareness and training, right? And this, it just not talk about, okay, go through some slides, hear a webinar and complete it. It also talks about how effective it is. Is it considering some best practices, system hygiene, and all of those? So Dhaval, this hopefully gives our audience some perspective of what are the key requirements, timelines, and to whom it is applicable. And probably we will, back to you in terms of the remaining aspects.
Thank you, Nara. I think this brings us overall on a common platform. What is expected? One thing I found interesting, Nara, and it's something that I'd want you to probably elaborate a bit more. I think all of us think of cybersecurity and about cyber resilience coming through firewalls, coming through access devices, or coming through some encryption or data backup setups. One of the things that I feel is significantly sidelined is the governance piece that you mentioned very early. So what is it? Has SEBI specifically recommended something from a governance perspective, or is it a very loosely defined term, which may or may not be followed in a certain sense?
So I'll probably break it into two parts. Interesting question. See, the topic of governance is basically the tone at the top. And how does it move down until the bottommost first? And second, are you monitoring it, or what is the means in which you are actually giving that direction? It could be risk monitoring, it could be cyber related monitoring, or for a very simple reason, do you have a mechanism to report to you if there was a small virus attack? As simple as that, right? And that's where probably this will give you some sense of elements, right, from a governance perspective. There is a necessity for you to have a board approved policy. And in fact, they've spoken about different types of policies, cyber risk policy, access, controls, a lot of these policies, and they are asking the board to approve it. Of course, you might say I'm a partnership firm or an LLP. In that case, you will have to consider as, the board of partners, etc. Then is very important is the cyber security risk context. And in the risk context, the expectation is that are you able to, talk about how you're doing a risk assessment? How are you aware that, I'm sure you have various people who talk about investment risk. Okay, there is a geopolitical issue, therefore it impacts my stock market. There is something which is going to happen in the regulatory perspective, therefore. So here we are focusing on, is there a similar assessment of a risk? A simplest example when we speak with clients is that, do you know what your risks are, right? Often they say, hey, probably a one or two, maybe password being shared, right? But if you actually go ahead and structure it, right, there could be different layers of risk at an employee level, risk at a technology level, as simple as your software not getting updated on real time, right? So those are all the risk context. And then comes roles and responsibilities. If you recollect, I said there are certain categories where they've said you need to mandatorily, I repeat, mandatorily have a designated officer. And some cases they've said even you need to have a CISO. And this is basically a chief information security officer who's in charge for this, right? So that's where your responsibility comes into picture. And then you also need to have an oversight and continuous improvisation. And this is where you do those periodical audits, review them, reports come to you. Very important, which is often missed out, is you could be held responsible, and this has happened in a few of our clients, where they have been held responsible for no fault of theirs because they're using a third-party service provider. I'll give you a simple example. Most of these AIFs today have the domain expertise in one side, but their accounting is outsourced. Their KYC or their shareholder details and investor details are sort of outsourced, and there's somebody else who maintains, maybe through an app, through a software, maybe even through an accounting system, right? Now, how good are the controls at that entity? And this is something which is missing. The requirement of the framework is that prove that your third party to whom you have outsourced is having adequate set of controls, right? And last, maybe there are some cases where you need to form a committee. Sometimes even it's asked for an external cybersecurity expert to come as a part of the committee. But this hopefully gives our participants some flavor on what these governance elements are, even though we keep on talking about governance, but this should give them some sort of a structured thought process, what is necessary.
Thank you. Thank you, Narasimhan. So as we get into the action mode, you mentioned that 1st April is when you should be able to show that if you have not adopted, you are in the process of adopting the SEBI's CSCRF framework. In doing so, what is the one thing, what is the first thing that an organization needs to do to set on the journey? Like what's the first priority for them for them to adopt the CSCRF?
If you recollect, I did make a mention, there are 19 categories for whom this is applicable. And immediately I had also mentioned that there are these 19 fellows may probably fit under one of those 5 limbs, right? Or the 5 categories. Now, this itself is a little confusing. I'll just give an example for people to understand this, right? Again, pardon me because if I'm moving about few steps here and there. But yes, first is you have to spend some time to understand what category you fall under, right? I'll just give you one example. Maybe this will help you. I just have one slide where it talks about an AIF. Okay. Now, AIF, as I said, it is based on your AUM which you have. And AUM is your asset under management based on the latest, last particular financial year, right? Now, if you are a market institution, they obviously an AIF will not be a market institution, so ignore that. But look at these 4 buckets. Your AUM is less than 100 crore. You are called as a self-certified. That means requirements are there. Audit is not mandatory for you. You have to give a self-declaration, but there are definitely a bunch of things which is necessary for them, right? On the other side, you have a small size RE who's probably less than 500 crores, mid-size 500 to 1,000 crores, and a qualified which is greater than 1,000 crores, right? Now that hopefully should give you an idea how the classification falls under. Now, given that this is the type of a classification, one should now start thinking, hey, I know what category I fall under, and probably start doing your readiness exercise. That is, what is applicable for me? What are my potential gaps? Compare what is applicable for you from a governance domain, from an identification domain. Remember the 6 broad cybersecurity functions. So we look from each of them, start doing that bit of a gaps. And once that is done, for most of our clients, what we have been doing is that we at least have a clear-cut roadmap. This is how you start addressing it. Some could be addressed by way of a policy, right? And don't think that, okay, ChatGPT will create a policy for you. Let me be very clear, right? We have noticed some people said that, no, I'll create a ChatGPT policy, but it is not able to get the real context, right? It is like taking somebody else's car and keeping in your garage without measuring the size of your garage and that person's car, right? It's often quite not practical, right? So then we start looking at the implementation of those controls and very important periodical monitoring, right? While periodical monitoring is something which is too early, we have actually started recommending some of our clients that please do a quarterly monitoring or a half-yearly monitoring. Because a year later, if somebody comes and evaluates and you have a bunch of those gaps, I'm sorry, you're too late and you have to submit this report, right? So this Dhaval will give you some flavor as to how to adopt, and probably that matrix which I showed you just gives an idea, but that's only for one category and there are a bunch of those categories. And probably we have made life easier for our friends, which we will inform a little later.
Okay. Can you go back to the slide where you had the example, the illustration?
Okay, here you go.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, in case of an AIF, the category is defined by the AUM of the AIF that we are looking at. And similarly, from, depending on what market intermediary you are, there are different criteria that will define whether you fall under the mid-size RE or a small size RE or a qualified RE.
Absolutely.
And based on which category you fall, your compliance requirements will be different.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you. So once you've done this, is this supposed to be audited as well? Do I need my statutory auditor to sign off something that I've done well on this?
Yes. So I'll probably answer it in a simple nutshell. I don't want to go through too many slides, but I'll just give you a perspective, right? Is audit mandatory? Out of the 5 fellows whom you look at the last guy. It says that you are self-certified, right? It's like my own declaration. So minus that category, all the 4 of them have audit mandatory. As a matter of fact, for the first 2, it is half-yearly audits, and for the rest, it's an annual audit, right? And they've clearly said who has to audit. It should be a CERT-In empaneled auditor who should be auditing you, and they have given even an audit report format, Dhaval, right? And that guideline, you remember, I said it's fairly lengthy. Towards the end, it talks about that. And not just that, if you fall under a market institution or a qualified RE, the auditor has to evaluate the effectiveness of control. And this for the first time it's happening. For those of you who know in the statutory audit or compliance space, you have something called internal financial controls, right? You measure the effectiveness of those controls. That means whether the control was effective throughout the year. Now, there are certain cases, the VAPT, or which is the penetration testing, right? Or it is the cyber resilience index they have. They have a capability index. I just call it as a maturity index. You need to monitor and you need to give your comments. And there is a scorecard as well. Of course, that's applicable for a market institution, but I'm just giving you a flavor as to how this space is evolving.
So tell me, if I look at this entire exercise, right? I adopt CSCRF, I look at where I belong, I install whatever I'm required to comply with the SEBI regulation. I'm done. It's a one-time thing and I'm good to do business, or is there something more to it?
I wish everything in life was a one-time affair, right? But sometimes you still have to have your roti kapda makan in terms of your regular periodical compliance. So I've had one very nice slide. Hopefully it will give some clarity. I've said that what is one time, ek bar kar lo and you'll be reasonably happy, right? Which is your gap assessment, drafting of policies or reviewing the first time your policies, implementing some of the controls, MFA, your setting up of SOC, and SOC here refers to, as I said, the operation center, which is monitoring it. Now, either you could set up your own independent SOC, or you partner with somebody else, or a managed service provider, or it could be using some market provided SOC, right? So those options are there. And this typically comes under the one-time exercise. But then you have a periodical exercise as well, right? An example is a vulnerability penetration testing. And whether we like it or not, for all of them, vulnerability penetration testing is mandatory, right? And they also say that the VAPT also should be done by a CERT-In empaneled auditor. So they're just giving some sort of a qualification requirements. Your periodical SOC monitoring is necessary, which means alerts, monthly reports, etc. would happen. Cyber audit, I did mention, Dhaval, in case certain scenarios twice or rest of them at least once, right? And for the smallest player, read it as, instead of cyber audit, read it as self-certification, right? Review of policies is an annual affair. Periodically, you need to review the policies and monitoring your security controls. It could be your access, it could be termination, it could be your antivirus solutions. You need to demonstrate evidence of monitoring. This is just one small illustrative set, right? Like I could go on, explaining, but I didn't want to create a fear amongst them. People saying that, oh, this is something which is way complicated. But yes, this requires some amount of attention from those people on the governance or the compliance officers.
Interesting. Any estimate of, will this require any CapEx investments and cost involved to be able to do this entire hula?
Definitely from a CapEx perspective, certain licenses would be required, but whole of this depends upon the infra which the organization is running. Let's take a simple example. If you are having your own servers, if you're having your own application which you're hosted, maybe on the cloud or even on your own office premise, right? So you would typically have a basic firewall. Now, this firewall and these applications have to be subject to a periodical SOC monitoring, right? So now you may have to install a solution, right? If you use a market SOC as an example, the typical costing may be anywhere between 750 or 1,000 rupees per month per device, right? And if it is a fairly complex setup, it will probably, increase to that extent, right? So that's a typical market SOC. Now, if you implement your own SOC for various things, there is an one-time implementation cost, maybe about 2 to 3 lakhs, right? On the other end, you might also have, periodical monitoring, which will be about, let's say, 30,000 or 40,000, but they will be a separate dedicated center for you who would manage your entire setup, right? So that's only on one element of a SOC. Then you have a vulnerability penetration testing. Typically, the price ranges anywhere between number of IPs, number of devices, right? Number of the lines of code which probably have to be reviewed, and it could be anywhere starting from 50,000 rupees, can probably slowly scale. We have cyber audit. Of course, those are again procedural aspects, but I think from a capex perspective, hopefully that gives you some sense of it.
Got it. Got it. So one of the things we mentioned earlier was that the entire CSCRF regulation is effectively coming in 5 flavors depending on your size and complexity of your business, right? How does one figure out which regulation or which flavor is applicable to my organization? And what does that particular requirement entail from my side?
So if I have to put it this way in a nutshell, right? The first step is basically identifying those 5 categories. But hopefully, I will bring up this particular slide. Yeah, the scope of engagement, right? You could fall under any of these 5 buckets depending on where you are, right? But typically, this is how the engagements we are doing is starting off. Doing a gap assessment for irrespective of what category you fall under, doing some amount of implementation exercise. And when you use the word implementation, we're talking about hand-holding them, policy drafting, deciding, speaking with vendors as well, because sometimes they're a little confused, right? Even doing that bit of a pricing related assistance, doing some sense of policy review, which is necessary for all of them. Risk management, at least for a few categories, it is extensive. For a few of them, it is limited. Setting up this maturity index, which is called as cyber capability index. In fact, they call it as a CCI. It looks a little complex jargon, right? There is basically a yardstick or a scorecard which you need to do, and for probably larger players, it is very much in detail. For the smaller players, they've exempted. But there is this requirement of access review, which most of them do not do it. Let me be very, very honest, right? Most of them do not do it. And this requires some sense of intervention. And it could also be some of the users who have superior rights. In a technology parlance, we call them as privileged access. In a layman's language, it could be a simple administrator. Say, for example, assuming we have somebody in this webinar who's the host, as well as we have both of us who are the participants, right? The host would obviously have a superior rights, right? So that access review is also something which has to be looked into, which most of the cases, in my experience, people do not do it, right? So that's something as a process we'll have to bring in. Periodical training, setting up a SOC monitoring, which we spoke, security operations or a monitoring center, performing the VAPT, and probably the cyber audit. So could be your broad perspective, how you should look into, depending on which organization, what would fall under. But hopefully this gives our participants some visibility that what exactly is required. I would not say this is an exhaustive list, but at least the key risk or the key requirements I've mentioned here.
Understand. So having done this already for quite a few clients, Narasimhan, if there was one challenge that you think that most people will face when they adopt CSCRF for the first time, what is the one thing that you think will be the hardest for them if they're taking up a CSCRF?
So the hardest is the easiest thing is identify which group they fall under, right? Because we know their turnover, or we know their capital, or we know their AUM size. We are able to decide. But what is becoming very interesting is, once I've decided that, going through these requirements and identifying what is required, right? One example could also be, setting up of SOC, right? A simple example could be what and for whom is a SOC necessary, right? Or what and why do I have to go for a vulnerability penetration testing, right? I just have 5 simple computers. I work on spreadsheets because I'm an investment advisor, let's say, as an example, or I am just a very small AIF and my whole of my subscriptions are through some 3, 4, let's say, some terminals, right? So am I really interested, or do I require to have all those, right? So giving that justification and understanding the requirements has been fairly an interesting challenge. Some of the other things could be, implementing to what extent do I need to do? Okay, I just implement password, right? A username and password. But implementing a multi-factor authentication in some of the solutions is a challenge, because the provider itself does not provide you an MFA. right? So that becomes a little tricky. For example, I might have a terminal which is probably helping me out to log in and log out, but maybe I'm just doing a view only visibility. So it's probably a low risk. But versus a person who's probably having access to configure, modify, change. Now he is required to have much more sense of multi-factor authentication, right? And implementing some of these access reviews, superior access reviews, managing your supply chain. Let me not forget this. This is becoming increasingly difficult because you may be great, is your vendor is your vendor good enough, right? So that is something which we have to address, probably asking the vendor also to submit certain reports, etc. In fact, there is also a requirement for ISO 27001 audits for some of them, which is again implementing a cybersecurity system, but that is applicable predominantly for the larger players. So the smaller players, it's slightly relaxed.
Got it. I think we are into our last 20 minutes. I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We have quite a few people and we already have some questions that people have put in. Just a reminder to everybody on the call, you can put in your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will read out the questions for Nara and we'll take them one by one. We've got the first question, Nara, is what are the submission deadlines for VAPT or cyber audit or SOC efficacy reports defined by SEBI? When do we actually need to have a report ready for submission?
Okay. So if you recollect, I said a certain category of players you have to do quarterly, certain category of players it is half yearly, right? So depending on that, on completion of the quarter, you're required to submit. They have not notified within 7 days or 8 days or 10 days, right? That is something they've not gone to that granular level, but they've just said that on a quarterly basis. And more importantly, if you have observations, this is where it's interesting. If you have observations, you need to update as to periodically, and it goes into certain cases to give monthly related updates as to how you have remediated it and how you have fixed it, right? So that's something which you should keep it in mind. For the smaller players, it's typically an annual reporting exercise.
Thank you. We have another question. One is, it's a specific case saying that our company is a member of NSE and we carry out only proprietary trading. We have no clients. Is it mandatory that we implement market SOC by exchange, or can we onboard any third-party vendor to do that?
So I will be able to answer based on the license definition which they have and the categorization they fall under. When you said you're a member of an exchange, I'm guessing they might be a broker because that's the type of an license which you would be having. In your case, it is based on the unique client codes, whatever is there. So basis that we'll have to look into it. If you fall under the smaller buckets, yes, market stock is definitely a good way for you to save some time of money and effort.
Thank you. We have the next question which is for a self-certified registered entity. MSOC is MSOC required for an Office 365 basic license?
Yes. So the way it is written, it is necessary for literally everybody. Right? The only benefit is for the smaller players. And when you use the word smaller players, I'm talking about self-certified or the small REs. MSOC is very good and very much acceptable procedure.
Another question is, what will be the penalty if we fail to implement SOC in time?
Okay, interesting question. Most of them, in fact,
this is for a registered entity that falls under self-certification.
Okay. Now, this is an interesting thing. Most of them are actually asking this that, because of the cost, I may probably want to take a workaround, etc. At this point, they have not given a specific penalty for each of them. Okay, you don't comply this is your penalty. You don't comply this is your penalty. No, they're not doing it. Right? SEBI has got that flexibility to give some certain imposition in terms of, probably a warning or a penalty, etc. So at this point, it is an open-ended. But since it is a framework and SEBI has clearly said it is a compliance requirements, it makes best sense that you adhere from day one.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few questions about where or what category applies to some of our participants. Maybe you can put up the utility on the screen, Nara. So for everyone, you can scan this utility on your phone and it will take you to a page which will tell you what is applicable to you. It will give you, based on your market license or your SEBI license, it will tell you a lot of things about what will be required, what is optional, and it will also give you certain views on how you can go forward to adopt the CSCRF framework. We have another question, which is for a self-certified registered entity, is a cyber audit mandate?
Self-certified, there is no cyber audit. You have to give an annual declaration and we have to follow that format.
Got it. We have the next question, which is, as the deadline for adoption is 1st of April, as on said date, first audit report will be applicable for submission on which date? Will it be applicable from 1st of April?
No, it'll be for the next year because the regulation is applicable from 1st of April 2025. So your effective audit period will be 25-26 if you are a smaller category of players. If you're a larger category of player, and when I use the word larger, I'm talking about the top two, you have to do a biannual submission. So for you, it will be April to September.
Got it. We have another question which says, we use an Office 365 basic license. However, for tracking or logging a higher version of Outlook license like Enterprise, which is 4 times the price, do we need to take that?
Question is, what use case are we trying to get by subscribing to the higher license, right? Now, to give an example, if Microsoft has its mobile device management system, we call it as an MDM. Now, that solution is available only for a higher pricing. Now, if you are an organization who are having sensitive data going on your emails, and the person or the employee also has access onto your mobile phone, right? There is a possibility that they could download the data and probably share it on your WhatsApp. I'm just giving a simple example, right? Your data could tend to leak. Now, this is where your mobile device management policy comes into picture. And maybe you have to go evaluate between Microsoft 365's MDM, right? Which is probably at a, I think they have E3 license, E5 license, maybe that, versus maybe opting for a third-party solution. So that's how you should probably start comparing these elements.
Got it. Thank you. The next question, Narasimhan, is more around policy. So does the policy need to be applicable from 1st of April, or is there a period by which there should be a policy available?
Technically, the regulation is applicable from 1st of April. So therefore, the policy is also required to be there. So my suggestion would be, in the event it has not been made applicable, have a note prepared saying that this is what we have done for this particular period, but at least the earliest period of applicability, please get started.
Got it. The next question is, given that we are a qualified registered entity, and we are taking services from our group company, and they are managing the SOC network, domain, and infrastructure. Is that workable?
Yes,
that's the first.
That is doable. That is doable. As long as in the SOC monitoring, your network or your devices or components are separately identifiable. It could be, at least I know that these are the devices which is there, or these devices, this is the risk which I have. So at least some visibility if I have on these devices, that is absolutely fine. Second, if you're a qualified RE, because you said QRE, you also have to measure the effectiveness of SOC. Now that becomes a critical thing, and you will have to convince the auditor that it has been effective. Those are only few things which you have to do. Given your situation, I think it is okay. Just that, the way you're doing it, probably you should relook into it.
The next question, Narasimhan, is ISO 27001 certification mandatory for a qualified RE?
Yes, it is mandatory. They have given you 1 year time for you to comply with it.
Okay, so you have to get the certification in the year 25, 26.
25 within before March 31st.
Got it. We have one more question saying that we are a portfolio manager and an alternative investment fund, which is a license that we received only in FY25 or in May 2024. And the fund is yet to be launched. And both fall under the self-certified registered entity space. So we want to know the implementation timeline and the approximate cost for implementing CSCRF for our organization.
So cost is a little difficult for me to give an opinion at this point. Probably you could just scan your QR code and probably share your data. But what I think would definitely help would be realizing the fact that if you have two categories of registration, and many of them do have it, they have we had a recent case. They're a research analyst. They also are an investment advisor, and they recently started this PMS, portfolio management, right? In all of these situations, if you are one single entity, let me be clear, one single entity having multiple license, whichever is the highest categorization, that would be applicable. Example, if one of the categories says, let us say QRE, self-certified, and the other category says mid-size would be applicable across, right? That is the first point I want to clarify. Second, there could be two registrations or two legal entities you have formed. The reason is because for a compliance purpose, AIF requires, let us say, another type of a license. Maybe investor advisor is requires separate type of license. Both of them are managed by one specific company or set of people. In fact, because AIF is a trust at the end of the day, the trust will not have any employees. It will just have bank account and probably, assets relating to that. Similarly, investment advisory license may be with one particular entity. In this case, you have to collectively read this and go for the implementation, because this is applicable for many AIF. They have 3-4 AIF, fund 1, fund 2, fund 3, but all of them is managed by one fund manager. So in this case, unlike the US, the fund manager gets the registration in US. In India, it is the fund who gets the registration. So the way we have to interpret it is all of them together as one report or one compliance is absolutely
fine. The next question, Narasimhan, is data classification necessary if the data is within the legal boundaries of India?
I clarified this. See, data classification is a different principle. Let us understand that. What is the meaning of classification? What is confidential? What is non-confidential? PII, personally identifiable information. You are giving some various buckets so that you know. Now, if you have seen latest Microsoft 365, the moment you open that file or Excel, etc., on top it says, gives you a title, confidential internal, right? So that's how it has been evolving. Now, that is a classification. Now, where the data is going to be stored, because I'll give you a simple example. Most of them said Microsoft 365 I'm using. Whereas Microsoft 365, if you're saving data on SharePoint, this data is saved where? It is actually saved in US, not in India. Right? Now, very fact of that, you will be falling under the non-compliance clause. So realizing this in December, they came up with a clarification. They said that the data localization, I'm not going to insist it immediately. I will notify it, subject to, probably the data privacy requirements, which is another topic of discussion, the DPDP Act, which is proposed, and the rules. Once they take shape, maybe we'll get some more clarity there.
Got it. And the next question is that for a qualified registered entity, the same one that, they're taking services on SOC and network and domain and infra from the group company. The question is, for ISO 27001, is the certification still mandatory for the qualified RE?
The moment you're a qualified RE, irrespective of whose help you're taking to solve your problem, ISO is 27001 certification is a mandatory exercise.
Got it.
And let me remind you, even if you have service providers, make sure they also are having these, because what applies to you will also apply to your service providers.
The next question is that in case a registered entity has multiple licenses, then will the VAPT or cyber audit has to be done independently for each license separately for submission, or a single process of VAPT or cyber audit for the entire registered entity systems would suffice?
To a limited extent, I clarified this. If your ecosystem, which is managing it, is everything the same, applications are same, infra is same, you're literally working from a common office, then it is possible for you to give a combined report, clearly mention that this report is applicable for all these three entities and perform it. If the regulator says, no, I need to have a separate report only the reporting per se, which is a cyber audit, maybe you have to produce 3 reports, but your VAPTs and other things can be done in a combined manner, but clearly delineating the scope, saying this is the asset of this AIF. This is an asset of, let us say, investment advisor. This is an asset of, let's say, PMS. If you are able to bring that, if it's a common asset, nothing much you can do.
The next question is for a self-certified registered entity, which is an AIF. The certification will be given by the close of the first quarter, or what is the timeline?
For a self-certification case, it's an annual certification. So that means it'll be after the end of the year. It's not a quarterly certification. It's an annual certification.
Understand. The next question here is around laptop security. So what kind of softwares or tools are required for the CSCRF that would be localized on the machine?
So again, I go back to the fundamental definition. What is the type of data which is stored on the laptop? Right now, many of them say that I have laptop, but laptop is merely a means for me to access resources. Everything is on the cloud. Right now, we need to understand the way in which the technology setup is actually being made. To give one example, scenario number one, you're accessing everything over a SharePoint, but you have a copy of the data onto your system, right? So accidentally you delete the data in your system, the SharePoint data also gets deleted, right? So which means you need to prove that you have a backing up system of this entire version controlling and all of those, right? So that is one set of a control. The other set of an issue could also be that I have all my data in my laptop. If my laptop is lost, right, what happens to my data? The problem is the entire data is lost and somebody can get access to it. So you need to prove that you have encryption, a BitLocker encryption or whatever methods, right? Your hardware has to be encrypted. Look, on the extreme side, I have my data on my laptop. I'm also able to open my WhatsApp, right? I can simply copy the data and put it on WhatsApp and delete it over. Nobody's even going to get to know that. And I can download it in my mobile and do mischief. This is where you require data loss prevention solutions or mobile device management solutions. So depending upon the scenario, I think I've just given you 3 examples. I can keep on going more, but I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. We have time for one last question. So the question is, for a self-certified RE, they will have time until end of the year to implement the provisions of CSCRF. And that is fine, right? Because they can certify it. They only have to submit a certification at the end of the year.
Unfortunately, that's an incorrect way of interpreting it. I would still say that it is applicable for right from day one. You could still say that, no, I will certify at the end of the day that I followed everything throughout the year. But I would say it is an incorrect practice because the regulation stands applicable on day one. So which means you need to prove with evidence, or you at least need to have it, because probably even SEBI can reach out, right? So I think it's not suggested that way. Highly recommended at the earliest, please get your implementation done, followed by a periodical assessment. In fact, Dhaval, we've advised some of our clients, and in fact, they have come back and said, hey, all this you're doing it now. A year later, I would have probably forgotten. Please come to me on a quarterly basis, at least do a check. I know I'm happy that if I've failed, I might rather fail on the first quarter and make sure I pass on the other 3 quarters rather than, fail the entire year. So I'm just giving you an example. So have that in the mind and look at what is required and the bare minimum necessaries.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Narasimhan. We don't have much time for more questions. You can put up the contact us page for anybody who wants to get in touch with us. You can write to us, you can call us, you can follow us on LinkedIn. I would like to thank Narasimhan for building this entire thing more from a practical perspective than a theoretical perspective. I hope we were able to get some clarity on these front. For more such webinars and discussions, please follow us on LinkedIn. We are doing our next webinar tomorrow, talking about the same CSCRF regulations applicable to entities in GIFT City. So that is happening tomorrow. Registration details are available on our LinkedIn page. Do follow us on LinkedIn. We look forward to more interactions with you. And let us know if there's something that we can help you with on CSCRF adoption. Narasimhan and his team have a lot of experience on implementing CSCRF, and we'll be very happy to work with all of you to overcome the challenges that we will see over the next few months in CSCRF adoption. Thank you very much, Narasimhan. Thank you to the In.Corp team, and thank you to all our lovely audiences for the interactive sessions. We've got a lot of questions. I hope we are able to answer them to your satisfaction. If there are any follow-up questions, you can always write to us, contact us on these details. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Take care.